This is episode 134 of Stand Up. Joining me today, author and journalist Sarah Posner and environmental journalist Brian Kahn of Earthe. I'm Pete Dominick. Time to stand up with me right now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for checking it out today. Oh, man, do I have great guests today. Two great guests. Sarah Posner is a journalist. She's got a new book that's so good, so important, and so terrifying. It is called Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. And I interviewed her for almost an hour. Fantastic conversation. Learned so much. Really important book. One of my favorite journalists writing about climate and energy and the environment is Brian Kahn at Earthe. He also joins me. We had a great conversation as well. But before we get to the interviews, just a couple things up top. Thank you, number one, for supporting this podcast with paid subscription. Could not do this show daily without over 600 of you supporting me with paid subscriptions. If you haven't signed up yet, sign up now for as little as $5. 626 total patrons to be specific. I never would have imagined we'd been doing this good, this quickly, and I could not be happier about it. Hopefully you notice in my performance, my work ethic, and how inspired I am and motivated by you guys supporting independent media, and we've got to get it up to a lot higher than this to be able to sustain it, but I'm very happy with the trajectory. Tell your friends, and thank you to all of those of you who have edited your subscriptions up from $5 to $10 or $10 to $20 or whatever it is, and that includes my friend Rich Lasker, who has been sending me all kinds of different ideas for the show, including, he said, reach out, you should get Jeff Sharlet on the show. You've all seen The Family on Netflix, or you've heard about it. Well, Jeff Sharlet wrote the book, The Family, and Rich, I got him. I'll be interviewing him actually tomorrow. I think I'll play that next week. But Jeff Sharlet on the show. Rich, thank you very much for the suggestion. You guys are producers of the show. You have great ideas for guests and other things, and keep them coming. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com, like Rich did. Rich sent me an email, and he said, you've got to play this on the show. Here is Charlie Sykes writing at the Bulwark to set up this audio. On Wednesday, Palm Beach County, Florida, held a public hearing. Its purpose, with the number of coronavirus spiking in Florida, the county commission wanted to hold a vote on mandating the use of masks in public, as they have in Broward and Miami-Dade counties. The vote came after a 2-hour public hearing during which angry opponents held up Trump signs, threatened the county board with citizens' arrests, invoked the wrath of God, and held a festival of crazy. Rich told me I got to play this, and this is crazy. This is absolute crazy. From the Palm Beach County public hearing, here is a montage of the crazy people down there.
We will get together and do a citizen's arrest on every single human being that goes against the freedom of choice.
I don't know. What do you mean you're going to get together and make a citizen's arrest against the freedom? What does that word salad mean?
Okay, you literally cannot mandate somebody to wear a mask knowing that mask is killing people.
Yes, you literally can mandate. You don't know how to use the word literally, but everybody's using this word. My teens are using this word constantly, inappropriately. Nobody knows how to use the word literally. I'm no wordsmith or vocabulary or grammar expert, but I understand how to use the word literally. And how is it killing people? It's saving people. This lady's nuts. Let's listen to more.
It literally is killing people. And we the people, are waking up, and we know what citizen's arrest is.
No, you're asleep and you have no idea what you're talking about. What's citizen's arrest?
Because citizen's arrests are already happening, okay? And every single one of you that are obeying the devil's laws.
And there it is. We've completely lost the message. The devil's laws? Oh, dear.
Are going to be arrested. And you, doctor, are going to be arrested for crimes against humanity. Every single one of you have a smirk behind that little mask, but every single one of you are going to get punished by God. You cannot escape God. You cannot escape God.
Excuse me, crazy lady, can you escape God?
I'm going to say that again. You cannot escape God, not even with the mask or 6 feet.
Got
okay?
it.
6 feet, like I said before, is military protocol. You're trying to get the people to train them so when the cameras, the 5G comes out, what? They're gonna scan everybody. We got to get scanned. We got to get temperatured.
Oh, no.
The kids have to go to school with masks. Are you insane? Are you crazy? I think all of you should be in a psych ward right the heck now.
Oh, wow. Talk. Irony is completely dead. It is really lost. It's over. This is Florida for you, but here's more. This lady actually sounds like she might be literate, this one.
The problem with humanity today is ignorance, arrogance, and apathy. Keep taking the road of least resistance. Keep listening to the TV brainwashing you from birth.
I don't know who she was talking about, but that made sense out of context, at least. Yeah, stop watching the TV. Kill your television. Stop watching Hannity. But here's more crazy.
And they want to throw God's wonderful breathing system out the door. You're all turning your backs on it.
Doctor, I really have many question marks about your degrees and what you really know. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't think that you are worthy of your credentials. And I would ask suggestively that you go back to school and get educated.
I would ask that you go back to school and get educated, says the lady who hasn't gone to any schooling or have any education. And Charlie Sykes writes in the Bulwark in reaction to this, several things to note here. Number one, these people vote. Number two, they have apparently consumed vast quantities of the toxic conspiracy theories that are all out there. Three, their opposition to masks is shared by millions of their fellow Americans. Funnily enough, it's almost the exact moment this drama was playing out in Florida. The Washington Post was reporting that more than 36,000 new infections were reported there by state health departments, surpassing the previous single-day record of 34,203 set on April 25th. Texas, Florida, and California led the way, with all three states reporting more than 5,000 new cases apiece. Charlie Sykes writes, so yes, we are now officially post-parity, and yes, we are definitely screwed. Ay, 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 says my friend Steve Chase. Ay, ay, ay. Okay, coronavirus cases, like I said, are accelerating across the U.S. 7 states, Arizona, Arkansas, California, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Tennessee are reporting record-high COVID-19 hospitalizations. Tuesday, more than 800 people died from the virus, the first time U.S. fatalities have increased since June 7th, and more than 35,000 new coronavirus cases were identified across the U.S., the highest single-day total since late April, and the third highest total of any day of the pandemic. Case numbers are rising in more than 20 states. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut will now require visitors from virus hotspots to quarantine for 14 days. Top federal health officials warn that the surge could worsen without new restrictions. Trump's administration, meanwhile, plans to end support for 13 coronavirus testing sites across the country at the end of the month, including 7 in Texas. What? 4 of the 7 Texas sites are in Houston and Harris County, which public health experts say could become the area worst hit by COVID-19 in the country. Oh, my goodness. And on all of that news, stocks fell on fears that officials would have to reinstate lockdown measures. Oh, boy. Black Lives Matter protests across the country have not led to an increase in coronavirus cases. That's great that these protests have not led to an increase, according to a new study from the National Bureau of Economic Research. The study looked at protests from more than 300 of the largest American cities, found no evidence that cases of COVID-19 increase in the weeks after the demonstration. So that's good. Everybody was worried about that. I was worried about that. And I think people were pretty careful. They were outside. They were wearing masks, unlike in the Coronapalooza in Tulsa, where they were inside and they weren't wearing masks and they were next to each other. So researchers found that social distancing measures actually went up in the wake of the protests. That's good. CNN reporting. Would you like some polls? Do you like polls? Do you want some polls? Here are some polls. 37% of Americans approved of the way Trump has responded to the coronavirus, while 58% said they disapproved, according to Reuters. 44% of voters approve of the job Trump is doing as president, while 53% disapprove, according to Quinnipiac. And one more, 50% of Americans say they would vote for Biden over Trump if the election was held today, compared to 36% who say they'd vote for Trump. In 2016, by the way, Trump won 46% of the popular vote. And one more story on the coronavirus. The number one tennis player in the world is an idiot, the complete idiot. His name is Novak Djokovic. I think I'm saying his name right. He is a noted and outspoken anti-vaxxer who hosted a tennis tournament despite warnings, gathered people in an arena without proper cautions. And guess what? Now, Novak Djokovic has contracted COVID-19. He's COVID-19 positive, an anti-vaxxer who wasn't worried. Oh, boy. We're in rough shape, folks. Let's do our best to stay together, communicate with each other, and not lose our sanity the way so many of our friends, family members have. We'll keep relying on each other, keep talking to each other, and keep working together to share ideas and resources. Thank you to listener and subscriber Rich for those sources, for the guests, for the audio clip that just made everybody mad, and for the increase in your subscription. Appreciate it, Rich. All right, let's get to my first guest. She comes highly recommended by Eric Siegel. She is an investigative journalist and author. Her new book is great. You've got to get it. It's called Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. She's on Twitter at Sarah Posner, sarahposner.com. Here is our conversation. And wait for the good part when my daughter Julia just walks right in and interrupts it. Oh, there she is. I'm really excited to finally talk to her. Anybody that Professor Eric Siegel tells me I should read or talk to, I always will. You come highly recommended, but I've been reading your new book, and it's so important, so well researched, and thank you. And scary, and very scary. Sarah, welcome to Stand Up. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
So I wanted to just talk a little bit about you and your career and how you've been covering these people and these issues for a long time. I guess you started covering the religious right back in college. Is that right?
Right. So I started working on the religious right in college back in the mid-1980s. But then after college, I went to law school and I practiced law for about 10 years or so before getting into journalism. So I had a little gap there where I wasn't doing that kind of work. So when I got into journalism, I continued covering the religious right. This was during the George W. Bush presidency.
Right.
And so I'd been covering that for years. I had written a book about the prosperity gospel and televangelists in the Republican Party that came out in 2008. And then when, this was my beat for many, many years. And then when Trump came on the scene in 2015, I also started covering the alt-right and the coverage of both of these movements coming together in support of Trump's candidacy and ultimately his presidency, basically formed the basis for me, the background for me writing this book, for writing Unholy.
Were you, just your personal opinion, having covered the religious right for such a long time, were you surprised by the kind of partnership and the joining of the alt-right and the religious right, given what you knew about today's modern religious right, much less the previous generation?
Well, in real time, as Trump's primary candidacy was rolling along in 2015 and 2016, I was surprised from the standpoint that the religious right had tried over the past decade or so to make itself more of a big tent, to present itself, to market itself as a movement that was not all white, that a movement that welcomed immigrants and people of color into their churches and so forth. So I was surprised because it was not the marketing that they had been doing of themselves for the past decade or so. But it's not surprising from the standpoint that the movement originally, back in the 1970s, was very much animated by racial grievance as opposed to abortion or LGBT rights, which are the main front and center issues that seem to animate it now.
Right. For this book, tell me a little bit about the type of work that you had to do and the people that you got to talk to. And you talked to pretty much everybody. You know the players and you did the work. But first of all, I mean, thank you. Somebody had to. I can't imagine what it was like to be at all those churches and all those services and hear and report on that must have been, challenging for you. Maybe not. I don't know. I know it would be for me. But thank you for doing the work. But what was it? What did you have to do for this book? What did you do?
So I did a lot of on-the-ground reporting, both during the presidential campaign, during the midterm campaign in 2018, but also just over the course of the many, many years that I covered the religious right. That, you know, all of this did not come together in some kind of 2016 to 2020 vacuum.
Right.
And so I have attended many mega church services, many conferences held by televangelists and by the political religious right organizations like the Faith and Freedom Coalition or the Family Research Council. I pretty much immerse myself in the media, their media bubble, because they do, the religious right does exist in its own media bubble. That's not just Fox News. That's a lot of other media and social media that they consume and provides an echo chamber for them, a pro-Trump echo chamber for them. I also went to a lot of, alt-right, white supremacist, neo-Nazi kind of events, particularly in 2016 and 2017. And spent a lot of time around the white supremacists of the alt-right, getting to know the way they were operating their movement, the way they interacted or intersected with Trump and the Trump coalition. So, and then I also, there's the middle section of the book that you're aware of that is kind of a history of all of this. How
really good.
The backstory of how this Trump coalition came to be. And for that, I did a lot of historical archival research to tell this fuller story of how this movement of religion and racial grievance that coalesced around Trump was in the making for several decades.
This is why books are, your book is, and your work is why books are important to read in their entirety. And I'm psyched to have you for a good chunk of time to have a conversation with you long form about the book. But everything that's wrong with media, sorry, I just got to rant for a second, is that someone like you works on this book for years, publishes this book, edits, does all the work, and then does a 2 or 3 minute segment on CNN or something like that, or NPR even. And so people have to read the entire book, because even in a long form interview like this, I won't be able to scratch the surface with Sarah because she did so much work. But let me try. So the religious right media, I'm so glad you mentioned that it's not just Fox News. People so often talk about Fox News, which is the big cable network, the most popular cable network, and obviously Trump's favored cable network, at least, although he's losing favor with them. They talk a little bit about right-wing radio. I think not enough. But I've been watching, and there's people who do watch these kind of YouTube shows and other podcasts and other shows where it's a religious person that calls himself religious, hosting the show. And they have massive audiences, like mega churches, many of them worth of audiences listen to these YouTube channels. That's what you're talking about when you talk about the religious right media, right? All these crazy, those are my words, not yours, pastors and people with their own channels online.
Well, YouTube is relatively new to this. I mean, I think something that's really important to understand about Trump and the way he enamored the religious right is that he was very much a student of televangelism. So even before there was YouTube and even before there was Fox News, there was the Christian Broadcasting Network, the Trinity Broadcasting Network, the Daystar Network. These are the three biggest networks for televangelism, but there are other smaller ones. Trump was a student of that kind of preaching, that kind of television preaching. The story that multiple people told me and multiple people tell about Trump was that he liked to channel surf, and he channel surfed and discovered Paula White, who's a very popular televangelist, but is now an advisor to Trump's, faith-based initiative, and for a long time was Trump's spiritual advisor or whatever, unofficial title she had. But he discovered her preaching on some Christian television network, invited her, she likes to tell this story, invited her to meet him in Trump Tower, and the rest is kind of history. So I think that Trump's first inroad into the world of evangelicalism was through televangelism, through meeting somebody like Paula White, watching somebody like Paula White. When Trump has a rally and he does these kind of like rambling, grievance-laden shticks, right, that everyone else sees as just kind of bananas. This is very familiar to me as somebody who's watched a lot of televangelism.
So Paula White, who is she and what does she believe? Because it's way, way out there.
So Paula White is one of many televangelists who preach what's known as the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel teaches that God wants you to be rich, and that the way to get rich is that a true believer can speak something into existence, like wealth or health, and that the way to get a supernatural return from your investment is to sow a seed with Paula White or Kenneth Copeland or whoever the televangelist or preacher happens to be, and that God will bless you with 1,000-fold return on your investment. And so these televangelists get very, very rich and fly around in private jets and have mansions, and in Paula White's case, a condo in Trump Tower in Manhattan. And this is very much, you could see this when I signed up for the text alerts for the Trump campaign, and they often do things like send you a text about, you can enter to win this, dinner with Trump, or this is your last moment to win this prize or get this benefit or get the new MAGA hat when it comes in. And it's very reminiscent of the way televangelists try to pull in their viewers, like make them seem, feel like they're part of some God-ordained supernatural kind of blessing. The same kind of tactic is used by Trump with his, in his campaign and with his followers.
And I don't know which reporter it was, whether it was Judd Legum at Popular Info or Dave Farenthold at Washington Post or somebody else who's uncovered that a lot of those win lunch with Trump's or dinner, it doesn't happen. He doesn't. Right. He doesn't show up. It's a pretty straightforward offer. And then he doesn't. I don't know if they bring an inflatable, a cardboard cutout, but a lot of times, obviously Trump certainly has promised charitable donations to veterans organizations and other places, and he does a rally, and that organization doesn't ever get the money. And I'm not sure how consistent this is with some of these televangelists, them not following through. But I just do want to mention that those things don't always happen. Those promises that are made and promoted by these people.
Right.
So you also cover in your new book, Unholy, which everybody has to buy right now. This is the way I do live reads. I just keep plugging away at my guest work because it's such an important book, is the relationship that politicians, and specifically presidential candidates and presidents, curried with the religious right and how they worked with them or didn't work with them. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationships between H.W. and even, Carter, obviously, Reagan, Clinton, Bush. All of it is fascinating. You talk about all of it. But the bottom line is, how do you get those people to vote for you? How much of an effort was there to get them to vote for you? You talk about John McCain. They weren't really excited with him until what happened?
Sarah Palin.
Yeah, and she's a, a Pentecostal?
Mm-hmm.
First one, I think you said, on a major ticket you wrote. What is the relationship that presidential candidates and other politicians have had to pick any of these, create with the religious right? What have they had to do, and how does it usually work?
So it dates back to Reagan, and as the religious right was being pulled together into a national political movement that was intentionally not just getting involved in promoting a particular presidential campaign, but promoting recruiting people into running for, local office and school board, city council, then eventually state legislature, Congress, whatever. So this is not just a movement that focused on presidential candidates, but the presidential candidates were obviously very important to the religious right, because then they could get their people into agencies, get the judges that they wanted nominated to the federal courts and the Supreme Court in particular. And so Reagan was the first to kind of pull this coalition together and cater to them. But, Reagan ultimately ended up being a disappointment to them. And so did H.W. Bush ended up being a disappointment to them, mainly because of David Souter.
Is that usually the primary thing, is that they say they'll appoint certain justices, not only at the Supreme Court, and in Reagan's case, what was it, Sandra Day O'Connor, and she didn't end up voting with them the way. And then you mentioned Souter. And now I think Trump is experiencing that a little bit.
A little bit. We can get to that with Gorsuch. Yeah. It's not just the judicial nominees. It's also the president's willingness to do the policy and rhetorical bidding of the religious right without worrying about which way the political winds are blowing. So some of the things that Trump has done, like, for example, he was the first president to go in person to the March for Life this year. This was a really big deal to the religious right because he signaled to them that he wasn't just going to send a video, that he really cares about the abortion issue, as if he really cares about the abortion issue. But those kinds of symbolic things are very important to them, and also just taking action on regulatory or policy issues that other presidents might have been afraid to do. Now, at first, when Trump first started to run, there were people in the political advocacy wing of the religious right who were very skeptical of his willingness to go that far for them because he had no track record on really being anti-abortion or even being really, quote unquote, Christian. But all of that has fallen away as he has given them the personnel that they want inside federal agencies, and not just the cabinet secretaries like Betsy DeVos or Bill Barr or Ben Carson, but also lower level political appointees who are hard at work undermining or subverting or even repealing regulations that were from the Obama era or before, protecting LGBT rights or protecting church-state separation or any number of things that they oppose. So I think a lot of what they're sensing right now is that he's just willing to do or say whatever. He's not worried about being politically correct, quote unquote, right? And that's one of the things that they really like about him. They think that everybody else had been too tepid or too concerned about bipartisanship or too concerned about what the what the media might say about them.
Let me try to frame it. What I heard you say when I'm reading in the book a little bit differently, and tell me if this is how it is. All of these other candidates, you write about them, they'll often tell their salvation story, which is an interesting thing, an important phrase, an important actual sale that occurs, and maybe it's genuine, maybe it's not. But certainly George W. Bush's seemed to be genuine. He was saved. He got sober. He found Jesus. It seemed very genuine. There are others, of course, who tell their salvation story that tout their bona fides for these religious right folks. But then when in office, they don't necessarily follow through with executive orders, with court appointments, with congressional appointments and laws, etc. However, Trump, on the other hand, doesn't tout any of this stuff. They don't even necessarily believe in him. But he's actually passing laws and promoting justices. He's doing the things that matter. They could care less what he actually believes if he's following through with what their agenda in a concrete way. How true is what I just said?
That's precisely right. And the layer of rationalization that they put over that is that sometimes God picks somebody who is unlikely, right? To say, some unlikely leader to save America at a time when America is at a precipice, at a turning point.
I think that's what liberals and Trump critics really don't understand. And I think that's what you and your work and your book points out, because most of us have a question that you answer in this book. I think this feels like the climax question for you in your book that you probably get asked the most. How do moralizing evangelicals fall in love with one of the most outwardly immoral presidents in politicians in modern American history? That's the question that liberals and Trump haters don't understand. And that's what I'm attempting to try to answer here. That's what your book does answer.
Well, I think the thing to remember, too, is that this shows their love affair with Trump shows just how much how deep their antipathy to...
There's my daughter. I tried to keep her out of the frame. I tried to act like it wasn't. She doesn't care. She's sleeping, and we have interrupted the queen. I apologize, Sarah. I'm trying to do it.
I totally understand. I have to regain my
blame Julia.
Train of thought. Julia.
Well, the question is how moralizing evangelicals fall in love with the most outwardly immoral president in modern American history, and before we were so rudely interrupted by my 13-year-old.
So I think that their love affair with him demonstrates just how deep their antipathy to liberal democracy runs, right? Because the thing that they like about him is that he's a disruptor. He is coming to smash the whole system to bits and rebuild it in a way that they want, or restore a lost America that they feel like has been trampled by political correctness, by liberalism, by secularism, by the civil rights movement. And so it doesn't matter. He is so strong and decisive that it doesn't matter that he has maybe had an affair, or has been married 3 times, or paid off a porn star, or, the list goes on and on. We all know
just
the list.
Just a mean and dishonest person. An indecent, immoral, mean son of a bitch. Just a horrible person. Doesn't matter. I mean, you think Christianity, you think religious people are kind people, or supposedly.
Yes. And so I think that there are evangelicals who held their nose to vote for Trump because of his promises on judges and abortion and so forth. But I think that there are a lot, I've interviewed them, and there are a lot who genuinely believe that God picked this. Sometimes God works in mysterious ways, right? And sometimes God picks an unlikely leader because that's what you need at this critical juncture in American history, when America, a Christian nation, is about to be overrun by these terrible, liberal, politically correct ideas.
What is it that they believe, Sarah? I think this is a really important part about your book and your work because of what their beliefs are. Is the following statement far off, or is it accurate? The modern right-wing evangelical right that you say and write about has joined with the alt-right is a white supremacist movement and a patriarchal movement. This is about white supremacy and men staying in charge. How much of this is like what we see in The Handmaid's Tale, and minus the diversity allowing black people into Gilead in leadership roles? How much of this new movement is just white supremacy?
So let me just...
Is that too simple?
Yeah, that's kind of too simple, right?
Okay,
because
fine.
The religious right and the alt-right did not set out to come together at this particular time, even though in the history of the modern American right, the racial grievance runs through all of it. But it's not that someone like Tony Perkins, who runs the Family Research Council, and Richard Spencer, who's, sort of a top dog in the alt-right, sat together in a smoke-filled room and said, we're going to both support Trump. It was more that Trump came along, and the way he articulated these grievances about what America had become appealed to people who the overt white supremacists of the alt-right and white evangelicals, which is a movement that has been, for which racial grievance has been a driving factor dating back much further than this, but in my book, dating back to the 1960s and 70s. So it was kind of a perfect storm in a way that, Trump came along and gave his opening speech about, rapists and criminals coming from Mexico, had these terrible racist rallies where, Black Lives Matter protesters were thrown out of the arena, and Trump would go on TV the next day and talk about how the person needed to be roughed up and they should have been roughed up more. And that as all of this was bubbling along and moving along and Trump never let up, and the media would say, you said or did this terrible thing. Are you going to, modify that or apologize for that or apologize for retweeting a white supremacist? And Trump, would never back down from that, or he would pretend like, are you asking me about David Duke? I can't hear you. Right. And
Roy Cohn's playbook. Yeah.
Right. And so what you had was these two movements coming together in support of Trump. Would the alt-right have supported Ted Cruz? Right, who was the top candidate to elites of the religious right? So, like, the political elites of the religious right were supporting Cruz during the primary, right, in 2016.
Because he seems a lot more authentically religious, although I question everything about that guy's existence.
Right. But at least he knew how to talk the talk. Right.
Yes. Yes. That's for sure. Yeah.
But what the elites were found was that the voters preferred Trump.
You say that there was no smoke-filled room between, say, Richard Spencer and Tony Perkins, but you do report on and did interview Steve Bannon, who Sarah, I worked with at Sirius XM. We shared a studio. His show is 6 to 9 a.m. My show is 9 to noon. So I went in and saw him every day when he hosted his show on the Breitbart show on the Sirius XM conservative channel called Patriot. And I got to know him okay. I got to see the way that he treated people well enough, and it wasn't good. But your interview with him is a lot more enlightening, to be fair, than my relationship with the guy from working next to him. What did he teach? I mean, he feels a little smoky in the smoke room, making those connections and organizing, and he was the Trump. He was Trump's brain. If Karl Rove is Bush's brain, I think Sarah Bannon. I'm so sorry, Steve Bannon was Trump's brain, and he knew. That guy's brilliant, a brilliant player. That's the way I see him. What
is he? I think he's given too much. Yeah. Okay.
I would argue with it, and I'd be happy to lose that argument. I really would. But why do you think he's not? Go ahead. You think he's given too much credit?
I think he's given too much credit for being sort of a deep thinker about political theory and political ideas. I mean, there was a period after Trump brought him on in the White House, right after Trump was inaugurated, when there were a series of articles written about, what's Steve Bannon's reading list right now. And, a lot of the coverage sort of made him seem like he was some very intellectual, chin-stroking kind of political genius, right? But he's more. It's
okay. So let me. I think that I agree. Okay. I don't think that he's a brilliant political theorist. Although I'm surprised that he held his own when debating David Frum. That was disappointing. That being said, I can think of a lot of people better than Frum that would have, I think, wiped the floor with him. No, I think he's a brilliant propagandist, media manipulator, campaign strategist. I think he's brilliant at manipulating the masses, as evidenced from the way that he hosted that Daily Show. I watched him do that every day, as well as the way that he ran that campaign. So no, as a political theorist and long term, I think his ideas have failed both him and the president in so many ways. But I think that I mean he's a brilliant manipulator, propagandist, ran that Breitbart, smart investor.
So yes, when I interviewed Bannon at the Republican convention, he claimed to me then, Breitbart's the platform for the alt-right. He was trying to seize the mantle of being the leader of the alt-right by saying that Breitbart is the platform for the alt-right.
Yes.
And he told me in that same interview that the alt-right needed the religious right to defeat the progressive left, because alone the alt-right was just not a big enough movement. So that was basically an admission that this white nationalist, ethno-nationalist, however you want to characterize it, movement that was relatively new, but like part of this international trend of these far-right autocrats and these far-right nationalists sweeping across
Western Europe
and Eastern
Brazil,
Europe, Western
even.
Europe, right. That this was a movement that held itself together or made itself a bigger coalition by appealing to Christian nationalists too, essentially,
Sure.
right.
Christian nationalists is the phrase that I want to unpack with you because, I'm sorry, were you finished with that point, though?
Right. So, yes, Bannon understood that. But I also think that there's kind of the element of the alt-right where you have overt Nazi rallies or overt white supremacists, where I think that on the one hand, the elites of the political Christian right would not associate with. On the other hand, right, like they wouldn't show up at one of those rallies. But on the other hand, when Trump said there were very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, they stuck with Trump nonetheless, right? So they're willing to just sort of let that kind of be part of who Trump is and not require Trump to be held to account for it.
Well said. Yeah, and it's what helps them win, that coalition. You write in this book that, the population of people who kind of believe what they believe is around 17% of these white evangelicals. And tell me if I have this wrong, but within the Republican Party, 27% of the Republican voters identify as such. And what I came away with is that's not that many Americans. How do they have so much power? And also, we do have to talk about what they believe. I probably should have asked that first, because this Christian nationalism is not democracy. It reminds me more of the Taliban and what they believe, or theocracy than democracy. But again, if it's only 17%, how do they have so much power and influence? And I know those are two separate questions and two huge questions. So apparently I'm not a master interviewer at posing them to you, however you want to take it.
So white evangelicals are about 17% of the population, but they're about, in 2016, they were about 25% of the electorate. And they're about a third of Republican voters.
Got it.
Right? So they vote in disproportionate numbers. They're very motivated to vote. And they're a very big segment of the Republican base. And in coalition with conservative white Catholics and other conservative mainline Protestants, they make up a big chunk of the Republican Party. And so the co-belligerency with conservative white Catholics is also very important when you think about, say, someone like Bill Barr, who's a very right-wing Catholic and is very motivated by his views against the separation of church and state, for example, that and his views are part of this coalition. So it's not just white evangelicals, although white evangelicals are the most homogenous, right? So white Catholics are more split, Republican, Democrat, white mainline Protestants are more split, Republican, Democrat, but white evangelicals are more like 80%.
You just broke it down perfectly. I think that's such an important point to point to them and then point to Bill Barr, but you can also point to the Supreme Court. Certainly Scalia was that way. Now Alito, I think, and Clarence Thomas, which is so disappointing, but also other judges as well. Can we talk a little bit about the justices and where they fit in with these beliefs? So
that's interesting, right? So yes, the religious right. When I use the term Christian nationalism, I'm going to get to the Supreme Court. Okay.
Take it however you want to.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So they believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that identity as a Christian nation has been undermined, basically by liberal democracy, right? By a liberal democracy that believes in pluralism, that promotes church-state separation, that promotes civil and human rights for everyone, racial and sexual minorities and so forth, for women. And so the modern religious right has pushed back and sought to undermine changes that took place mostly in the second half of the 20th century, and a lot of them having to do with Supreme Court rulings, invalidating mandatory school prayer or Bible reading and so forth. And as women and LGBT people have gained more civil rights, the religious right has framed that as an infringement on their religious freedom. So Gorsuch was valued as a Supreme Court nominee, not only because of his views on abortion, but also because he was seen as a defender of how they frame religious freedom. So, for example, the Hobby Lobby case, which probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with, where the Supreme Court ruled that a private company, a for-profit company, whose owners believe that contraception is a sin, or certain kinds of contraception are a sin, did not have to provide contraception in their contraception coverage in their health plan because that violated their religious freedom. So this is kind of the mindset with regard to LGBT rights as well, right? And it all stems from this idea that America is a Christian nation, and these laws protecting the right to contraception or abortion or protecting LGBT rights are an infringement on the rights of Christians in the Christian nation and signify an undermining of the Christian nation. And so last week, when Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion in the Title VII case, ruling that under the federal civil rights law, employers cannot fire people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, the religious right was extremely disappointed because they thought that Gorsuch and Roberts, who had been nominated by George W. Bush, would be on their side on that. They were opposed to sexual orientation and gender identity being included in the definition of sex. But he did leave this wide open possibility for them, or invitation, that they really viewed as an invitation, when he said in the opinion, this case did not address the question of whether somebody could claim that complying with this provision of the law violates their religious beliefs. And that will be a question for another day. And so the Christian right sees an opportunity there to keep chipping away or keep pushing this idea of religious freedom, that like every advance forward, say Obergefell, which
gay marriage,
same-sex marriage, was an infringement on their religious freedom. Again, this will be, and so it's just sort of this persistent, consistent, ongoing effort to portray these advances for other people as a setback for them and their religious freedom.
Yeah, it's also important to mention in the Hobby Lobby case, which forced companies to have to cover employees with birth control in their insurance plans, the Obama administration did everything they could to give them carve-outs. Like, a lot of people were upset about that, but that they gave them ways out of having to do that, as opposed to what we see now, where there's not any of that compromise. That being said, what about what we hear from the president, Republicans, a lot of these people, these Christian nationalists, and everybody that you're writing about, and you just mentioned it, the phrase religious freedom and religious liberty is used all day, every day. Mm-hmm. What my progressive ears hear is the freedom and liberty to discriminate, the freedom and liberty to punish people because of their sexual orientation. And I would go as far as also say because of the color of their skin. And I think of Loving, or, marriage between blacks and whites. I think of whether or not you have to serve a black person at a counter. Yeah, we're forcing you. You have to do this. They see that as an infringement on their liberties and freedoms. I see it as the freedom to discriminate. Help me understand more their point of view on this phrase and what it means and why it's so effective.
Well, today they would claim they do claim that this is not about race, that they would never, make a claim of religious freedom like in Loving or in, the counter-service cases of the 1960s. But
although I feel like we've heard these justices in confirmation hearings, they didn't say where they fell on integration of schools.
Yes. Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up. So something like close to a dozen of Trump's judicial nominees, this is to the lower court, the trial and appellate federal courts,
which are still very powerful.
Right. Refused to say in their confirmation hearings whether they thought that Brown v. Board of Education was correctly decided. Now, we're very familiar with the dance that they do on Roe v. Wade, right? Right. We're very familiar with that. But when did we think in recent memory that somebody would think it was controversial to say that whether Brown v. Board of Education was correctly decided, right? I think this is
That's a new dance. It's a new dance.
It's a very new and troubling dance. But when you look at the history of the religious right, which I detail in the book, white evangelicals and fundamentalists became involved in national politics and became interested in getting involved with an organization like the Moral Majority because of issues that arose from school desegregation. So after public schools began desegregating after Brown v. Board of Education, the IRS decided that private schools could not avoid desegregating just by virtue of being a private school. So the IRS said, we're going to take away your tax-exempt status if you don't have a certain percentage of minority kids in your school, or if you, can't achieve that, we'll let you do things like recruit more minority teachers or recruit more minority students from the community. I mean, they gave them lots and lots of chances to desegregate, basically, even if they hadn't intentionally made the Christian school in order to be segregated. The IRS was saying you can't have a tax exemption if you're effectively segregated. And the IRS did take away the tax exemption of Bob Jones University in South Carolina, a fundamentalist college which banned interracial dating. And the IRS took away their tax exemption, and this was a cause célèbre for the Christian right. The idea that the IRS some unelected bureaucrats would infringe on the religious freedom of Bob Jones University and of these other Christian schools, colleges and K through 12 schools, was just the height of what was wrong with the government, what was wrong with Washington, why Washington was infringing on the rights of Christians all across America. And this was much more motivating for a lot of white evangelicals and fundamentalists than was abortion initially back in the 70s. And today you hear the echoes of all of this in virtually every case that deals with these kinds of issues. So even after the Bostock case, the Title VII case last week, people in the Christian right started talking about, now is the IRS going to come and take away the tax exemption of nonprofit employers who won't hire gay people? And it just seems to never go away. And so it is the heart of their religious freedom argument that their religious freedom is compromised by the rights of other people.
Well, but it's also really important every time I hear them talking about religious freedom and religious liberty, as someone who is not religious, I get really offended because, like I said, it sounds like the freedom to discriminate. But for people who are religious, I'm thinking of Jews and Muslims, they're not arguing for their religious freedom. So the point is, that's code religious freedom for our brand of Christianity specifically.
Yes.
Is that a fair interpretation?
Yes.
So I also think that it's important that you mention in the book that Trump is not an anomaly, and we focus so much on him being the problem, and that once he's gone, things will, quote, go back to normal or be better. But this movement isn't going away. And as you said, it's never ending. And this court could decide on abortion rights in a very important case coming up. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, it will illustrate that it's never going away and that Trump's reign matters. But talk to me about why you say he's not an anomaly and it's a lot more than Trump.
Well, he's not an aberration. I mean, he may be an aberration in his particular style, right?
Right.
But
although there are preachers like him, as you said
that's
earlier.
right. That's
like
right.
He's modeled himself.
Right.
Yeah, but they're not politicians.
I don't know that anybody could pull off his particular brand of chaos, right? But I think that that's part of the appeal to some parts of the religious right base, particularly the charismatic and Pentecostal prosperity preaching kind of part of his base. The chaos is sort of like exciting and part of the celebrity and part of the adrenaline almost. But we are seeing this resurgence of white nationalism, ethno-nationalism, now in combination with this Christian nationalism, across the world, right? And we're seeing it in the United States, not just in Trump, but in candidates for elected office, in people who are already elected to office. You know, the Tom Cotton op-ed in the New York Times, or the Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, his floor speech the day of or the day after the Bostock decision from the Supreme Court. I mean, he was articulating this very idea about the religious liberty issue. And Hawley is a much more, he offers that same sort of religious freedom vision, but in a much more refined, if that's the right word, way than Trump would. And also Hawley is a lawyer. And so he understands all the legal terminology and ins and outs. You know, Trump gets away with just saying some buzzwords, religious freedom and religious liberty. But there are other people like someone like Hawley who can do that and, you know, make a legal argument.
Your book was, of course, published before, I guess, the outbreak and the Black Lives Matter movement. Yeah. But I've heard, and I wonder, and I keep saying this on the podcast, so if it's wrong, please let me know what you think about it. I don't know if you have any reporting on it, but I have heard that when the president broke up the peaceful rally outside the White House, walked over to the church and held up the Bible, that really turned off a lot of the people that you're writing about, white evangelicals. I don't know why people say that. I don't know why that would be the thing. Do you have any reporting or any thoughts on whether or not there's any accuracy to that?
Well, I think that undoubtedly there were some people who were turned off by it, right? But on the other hand, it was definitely touted by others as a sign of his great strength and decisiveness, and that he was standing up for the churches who are under siege from these radical rioters in the streets.
They spun it that way.
They spun it that way because St. John's, the church across Lafayette Square from the White House, had a small fire in the basement one of the days during the protests. And so some of Trump's supporters spun that as, you know, these Antifa rioters are going to come and burn down your church. And here's Trump showing you that he's going to stand up for the churches. Never mind that many of these conservative evangelicals would say that St. John's Church isn't a true Christian church because as an Episcopal church, it supports LGBT rights and same-sex marriage and so forth.
Led by a woman.
He would, and he just basically, used it as a photo op. And I think it's iconic for Trump's detractors. And I think that because it's iconic for it's becoming iconic for Trump's detractors, his supporters, after initially touting it as, a sign of his great strength, are now sort of moving on. I think that whoever organized it for Trump thought that it would be this great moment. And it's turned out not to be a great moment, but I think that then they're not really using it as a terrible moment like Trump's critics are. but perhaps just, moving on from it to something else.
Finally, this book is so good, so important, and everybody needs to read it. And they need to read it now because this is the most important election of the planet and ever, the planet's life ever. And what is it that, if there were one takeaway in our conversation or why people should read this book, do you think people should really know about what is happening right now in the next 130 or so days before November 3rd?
I think...
What's the biggest takeaway?
Our democracy as we know it is at stake, right? A democracy that supports a free press, an independent judiciary, separation of powers, and protection of the civil and human rights of everybody. This is what's at stake.
Sarah Posner, the book is Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. And if you're listening to my voice right now, I'm not sure why you're not ordering this book right now. That you should be ordering the book right now. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me, giving me so much of your time. It's such an important and good book, and I can't wait to finish reading it, as terrifying as it is.
Thank you, Pete.
Sarah Posner, check it out. Get that book. You've got to get that book. SarahPosner.com, and follow her on Twitter. Tell her you heard her on the show. It's the first time I've ever talked to her, ever interviewed her. Didn't have her on the show at Sirius XM, and I'm really excited to have discovered her very important work, her past work as well. SarahPosner.com, at Sarah Posner. Right now, go to Twitter and let her know that you heard her here. All right, I love following and reading journalists who cover climate, the environment, and energy. And one of my favorites is Brian Kahn. He's over at Earthe, which is part of the Gizmodo media brand, and he's the managing editor at Earthe. And at least once a month, I try to catch up with him and go over his latest articles and posts, and that is what we did. And Brian is also on Twitter at BLKahn, at BLKahn. Follow him there, Kahn. Read him at Earthe. Here is our conversation recapping his latest reporting. Great to see Brian Kahn. Thank you very much for joining me again, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
There's a bunch I want to talk about your recent posts at Earthe, but I want to go back to early June when you wrote a really important and interesting piece about how the environmental movement and the racial justice movements merge. And it's super important to talk about some of the other stuff that you've been writing. But this piece is titled, "There is no climate justice without defunding the police." And you've got another piece about environmental justice, about 224 environmental groups that endorse the movement for Black Lives Matter, some of which hadn't, and you reached out to them. But if you could talk about kind of both these pieces in the movement overall, it's a pretty interesting, important idea. But it does seem like the environmental movement has always been pretty white. But maybe I'm wrong.
You are not wrong. It has been pretty white. But I think that, what we're seeing now is a movement that's becoming more diverse and reflective of, society at large. And that's being driven by young folks, by millennials, by people that sort of are not content with the status quo in general. And so we're seeing that as sort of this driving force that's now pushing some of these older traditional environmental groups to sort of get on board and recognize sort of the past wrongs they've done by being largely white, by supporting types of conservation that maybe have pushed people of color or indigenous communities out of the way. But they're also, so they're basically in some ways atoning for those past misdeeds. But that's not to say that, they've done this one thing and now they're good to go. There still is a long way to go, but I think that we're, seeing progress and change in ways that, if you'd asked me, even 6 months ago, would we see this kind of shift? I don't know if we would, but things are very different right now.
I feel like there are the overt obstacles for people of color, especially living in urban areas. And then there are the obstacles that you don't necessarily see. And I think when we talk about police brutality, that's an obvious issue that's been around for a long, long time. Ask any Black community about that, of course. But we don't really talk about lead in the water or coal pollution. And you don't see those, but they certainly have ravaged Black and brown communities and poor communities around the country. And therein lies, to me, the part of the merging. Can you talk a little bit about how pollution of air and water has destroyed lower income and specifically Black and brown communities?
Yeah, absolutely. Those sites, so those communities are the ones that are the places where fossil fuel infrastructure ends up. There are places where the garbage dump ends up or the incinerator ends up. And there are places that have kind of sort of been treated as almost these sacrifice zones for industry. So, that in turn has led to this legacy of all sorts of health impacts. You see higher rates of asthma in Black and brown communities. You see in places like Louisiana has an area called Cancer Alley where it's just a petrochemical, I don't want to say wasteland because people live there, but it's a place that's been basically overrun by the petrochemical industry. And the rates of cancer in that area are just absolutely off the charts. And again, it's home to mostly Black communities who are living in the shadow of these plants. I've had a chance to visit it a couple years ago for a story, and I was just absolutely blown away by the infrastructure that exists there. It's sort of almost, for most Americans, it's kind of out of sight and out of mind. But for those Americans that are living in those places, it's definitely not out of sight and it's definitely not out of mind. So, there's that kind of legacy. And then there's also the fact that, these communities have dealt with, processes like redlining where they've been deemed risky investments. And that sort of scared away, good kind of investments. And it's also left them in these really, I guess, sort of impoverished states where even the infrastructure that is there is crappy. So it means there's less parks, which means that those places get hotter, which means that you're dealing with more heat-related illnesses as a result. So really when we're talking about, climate justice or environmental justice as, something that is real, I mean, these impacts are very serious. And yeah, when you go into these communities, you can see them firsthand. And the people that are living in those places are dealing with them firsthand. And, you can't ignore it when you see it. And I think for too long, the environmental movement has kind of focused on, let's go save a park. Let's set aside this land and nature so that then, folks can go for a hike. And as a former park ranger, that's great. But the reality is that you also need to look at the places where people are living and figure out how do you make those places more connected with nature and more just resilient to the impacts of climate change that we're seeing.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack about how that can happen, who's doing it, and what the obstacles are. But just going back to that piece that you have at Earthe, there is no climate justice without defunding the police. This is it's always seemingly now a provocative idea. This phrase is a provocative phrase, defunding the police, abolish the police. But your approach to it in this and reporting in it in this piece is really important and really interesting. How do you connect climate justice and defunding law enforcement?
Well, I think that, it goes back to the idea of what does it actually mean to defund the police? It doesn't mean that, we just get rid of the police completely. It means that we think about the problems we face in society and what is the right way to address them. Too often the police are kind of just like the hammer that we use to kind of whack on everything, whether it's responding to someone that's, mentally ill and having a breakdown, whether it's someone that broke into your house, or whether it's someone that's sick. So the thing is that we don't, necessarily need the police to respond to all those situations. And too often we see with, disasters, we see the police as kind of these first responders. And it's not to say that they, there aren't some that respond well to that, but the reality is that we need to be thinking like in a climate-constrained world where we're dealing with more storms, we're dealing with more chaos. Do we really need, what we've seen with our police forces becoming these more militarized, almost paramilitary forces? Should that be our first response? Is that the first thing we should return to, to respond to disasters? And the answer in my mind is no. What we need is people that are equipped and skilled and know how to respond to disasters in a way that doesn't put communities in danger. And so when we talk about, defunding the police, to me, it's a chance to divert some of the resources that are being devoted to policing now and put it into things that actually either make communities more resilient off the bat to disasters or that help respond in ways that can really help communities rebound fast and equitably once disaster hits.
And don't let anybody tell you that the police forces are on a small budget. I mean, in this piece, you do a lot of good research here, just pointing to how much money they get from the federal government, for example, and we could talk about that. But I want to move on to a couple more things. But there's a lot of money that could be redistributed, and for the reasons that you've just suggested, would be really important and good ones. But you also reached out to, or I should say, 200. This piece, another piece at Earthe. 224 environmental groups endorsed the movement for Black Lives, but it can't end there. Some of them did not sign this, I guess, what was it, a letter, and you reached out to some of them. But what specifically are these groups doing substantially to, not only endorse the Black Lives Matter movement, but how do they answer those demands? What are they saying, and why didn't some sign it?
I mean, well, why didn't some sign it? That's for those groups to answer. Some of them chose not to sign it because it's, they're, at least from what some of them told me, it's red tape. They're putting their organizational reputation on the line. And so, I defer to them and say, well, what is your reputation? What do you stand for? Or what don't you stand for if this is not one of those things? It's certainly one of the questions. So, as far as what does it mean for these groups to actually stand with, the movement for Black Lives? I mean, it means endorsing some of their demands like defunding the police, abolition, those kinds of things. It also means, I think, for these groups really internalizing what does it mean to really stand up for Black lives and provide the opportunities that, Black people need to see in these movements. I mean, like you mentioned earlier, these movements are largely white. In the management level, they are almost exclusively white. And so what does it mean to actually bring Black people and other people of color into the climate and environmental movement and respect their demands of things that they actually view as priorities? It may be that some of those folks very well do think, we should go save the park over there. But it may very well be that the demands look different. And that changes the actual structure of what the environmental movement is doing and the things that it's trying to accomplish. So, that's not a thing that you just solve in a few weeks or even a few months, and potentially not even in a few years. But I think that, the first step is obviously these groups need to listen to these constituencies they've ignored. And then I think it's actually doing the radical change they need to do to integrate those interests, those demands, and those people into the movement itself. And so that is, like I said, a very, it's not an easy process, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. And, it means that it's going to take a commitment much longer than just, as long as these protests are going on for in the streets right now.
Yeah, all of these pieces that you've got at Earthe there that talk about environmental justice and racial justice are really good, and everybody should go read Brian's stuff there. I did see another piece of yours from early June. I did not like this headline at all. Carbon dioxide has never... Well, I don't like most of your headlines, I should say, but I love what you're talking about. Carbon dioxide has never been higher. I thought the pandemic brought rates of greenhouse gases to a low point because all around the world, we were staying at home. We weren't getting in our cars. We weren't creating the massive carbon footprints that we normally do. So what happened?
Well, unfortunately, fortunately, we did see emissions drop a little bit. The reality is that, last year emissions hit a record high. So even if they drop a little bit, it actually doesn't make that big a difference in the scheme of things in the atmosphere. So, the reality is as long as we keep emitting carbon dioxide, even if we start to lower the amount, every year the concentration in the atmosphere still goes up. And so every year we still hit a new record. And so, it's kind of one of those stories that writes itself in a way. Like this year, no surprise, we kept emitting carbon dioxide throughout, all of last year and right up until, its peak in May. And so we hit a new record. So even though the pandemic made this little dent, it's not that, suddenly everything is solved. What we really need is this sustained effort to draw it down and then eventually hit zero. Once we hit zero, then we can start to see carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere actually drop. And, when that happens, it'll be great. The reality is, too, though, that it doesn't just drop overnight in the atmosphere. It takes decades to kind of reach an equilibrium. So, unfortunately, the record story is going to stay with us for a while.
Yeah. Well,
sorry.
Yeah, well, that's journalism. That's your reporting. It's really important. It's a sad truth. But the other point, and you wrote about this as well, and I think it's interesting is, and a lot of people are talking about this, the idea that working from home has, a lot of us have learned that we can work from home. Companies, firms have said, yeah, we can do this. And that would mean that we wouldn't be commuting. And I think I read something of yours or somewhere else yesterday that commuting is probably one of the main or primary causes of our carbon footprints, that we're driving to and from work. One individual, one car, so many millions of cars around the world. Often long commutes as well, like the one I used to have and don't miss. You read about the potential for a 4-day work week and how that would be a game changer. Just tying all of this together, what have we learned in terms of working from home and commuting and how we could restructure our lives to reduce our carbon footprint by reducing how much we're actually moving specifically to and from work?
I think the most important thing we've learned on that front is actually seeing that, the way we've done things is not the way that we have to keep doing things, that, humans are adaptable, the systems are adaptable. Certainly, there are essential workers that say working at a grocery store, that, you can't do that job from home, right? But I think what this pandemic has shown is that, if we work from home a couple days a week, that's one way to start cutting emissions. Do we cut, things down to a 4-day work week? I mean, would that reduce emissions? Yes. Would it make everyone happier? I mean, it would make me happier. I wouldn't complain. So sure, let's think about that. There's no one silver bullet solution to addressing climate change. But I think that all these little things that we're seeing pop up here and there and that we're starting to discuss show that we can make these changes. We just need to sort of make the choices to start to do that. And we also need to think, the reality is that some folks that are working in the restaurant industry or at grocery stores, wherever it is, that can't necessarily work from home, we need to think about how to support them. So what does that mean for improving transit or accessibility by providing more bike lanes? I mean, things like that can help people get to work in different ways when they need to. These are all ongoing discussions, and I hope that, the reality is that whether it's city leaders or federal leaders, they're trying to think through these things now, because we're at this moment where we have a choice and we can choose to kind of go down the road we were going down. And that's not one that I think is particularly great. Or we can sort of take the lessons that we're learning right now and enact them for ways that actually make our society a better, happier place, in addition to one that emits less carbon dioxide.
Well said. Very well said, yeah. You're always covering the fossil fuel industries, and you've got a couple of pieces about oil, big oil, talking about BP laying off 10,000 workers, and talking about a little mistake that Chevron made in a piece titled "Big Oil is Scared Shitless." And I meant to mention this one before we got done with the racial injustice thing, because I was building up to that, and then of course I forgot it and got off track. But this is important because basically Big Oil, who you write has spent decades perfecting the art of lying and pursuing a strategy to divide the public so it can continue its polluting ways. It's been a successful model that has run into a brick wall, and that is the new climate movement. So let me just ask you first about that in terms of generally, because you've been writing a lot about this. As you say, they're throwing up all kinds of things against the wall, and we'll talk about this piece most recently in terms of a wedge issue to try to divide black folks and environmental activists. But when you say they're scared shitless, the title of this piece, just generally speaking, what is Big Oil doing? Because you saw the market disruption based on the dispute between Russia and Saudi Arabia, obviously the pandemic lowering demand for oil, and at the same time finding new alternative renewable sources. So my thesis here is Big Oil has been scared for a long time, and they really are looking desperate. Generally speaking, what is their feeling? What is their concern?
I mean, I think that, what we've seen with Big Oil is that they have, Big Oil stocks return less and less over the past couple decades. I mean, we've already seen them start to decouple from the S&P 500. So oil is already becoming less profitable. And then the new climate movement hits, and Greta Thunberg makes Big Oil enemy number one. And all of a sudden, there's all this push to really call out the bad actors that are the fossil fuel industry. And then you have this pandemic hit, and demand drops, and then you see the oil prices plummet. All these things are happening. So this Big Oil was already kind of, I guess, on the run, so to speak, in some ways, which is a weird thing to say for, an industry dominated by multi-billion-dollar companies. But the fact is, their profits are not what they once were. They're never going to be what they once were. And so I think you're seeing these companies think, a few things. I mean, you see certain companies, particularly European ones like Shell and BP, say, well, how do we transition to quote unquote, an energy company? We do everything. We do clean energy. And some of that's greenwashing. Some of it, if we want to be kind, maybe we'll see in the next couple of years how that transition happens. But you see a lot of these American companies like Chevron really just try to dig in their heels and sort of milk the last couple bucks out of the system and keep the good times for them rolling as long as they can. So that's kind of what we're seeing now with the Chevron thing that you mentioned, where they were sort of tied to potentially tied to a campaign to divide the environmental industry along racial lines. And so, this is just like I said, they're really trying to keep the last little bits of oil flowing out of the ground that they can. And the sad part is that, what they're inevitably going to do is leave, shareholders and also fossil fuel workers kind of in the lurch. And so that's kind of my concern when I see this, especially, is not just, thinking about, good, rah-rah, down with these companies. It's well, this sucks, because what they really should be doing is thinking about how do they take care of the people that have actually built up these profits for them.
Yeah, when you say potentially tied to, and your piece here refers a lot on reporting from E&E, right? on this PR campaign. But it's important that you say potentially, because Brian is a journalist, and I like to talk a lot about journalism here. And as much as we might really despise a company or a person, we also want to be clear as we're communicating with whether or not there's evidence of a charge, of a claim. And that's what that word meant. And I just wanted to take that as a learning moment, because you're a journalist. You happen to be covering energy and the environment and the environmental movement, but you're not going to lie in your work about, and you're going to be as clear as you possibly can about, sources and sourcing. And this looks pretty bad, like it was Chevron that basically had this campaign to drive this wedge between black folks and environmental activists. And it looks that way because they fucking accidentally put their name on it, to be clear.
Yeah, and this is from an outside group that they're working with called CRC Advisors, which is a very, very shady, low-profile PR group that works with conservative, causes and with big oil companies like Chevron. And so, in some ways this email was sent by one of their ad accountants or executives. And so it definitely points to Chevron and, Naomi Oreskes, who's a person that has spent, a decade plus looking at the connection between big oil and advertising and false advertising. I think her line was that their fingerprints are all over it, but is there a definitive link to Chevron? Not necessarily, but, it certainly fits the pattern. It's some interesting circumstantial evidence, we'll say.
And this company, CRC Advisors, they bring in black conservatives like Ken Blackwell, former Secretary of State in Ohio, and who is this other guy who is an ad guy? You have it in your piece.
Oh, Derek Hawley, yeah.
But I looked at that piece and I was like, Brian, have you ever seen like evidence of like where these campaigns start? Like, it's clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to drive a wedge between black communities and the environmental movement. And we've seen this so many times in politics, driving a wedge. Does anybody ever say we need to create a campaign to drive a wedge between these two communities? Do those words get said? Is there an email? Is there a directive? Have you ever caught any executives red-handed employing a strategy that way?
I mean, it's never that overt, right? Or at least it's never that overt in the public eye or in ways that I guess, some journalists have been able to uncover. But it's pretty clear. I mean, if you look at, Chevron again, like their management, it's mostly old white guys, and their goals from what we've seen, both in terms of their actions and in terms of like the whole, historical case of big oil lying to the public, they do is everything they can to muddy the waters and do that to drive that wedge between people, or to at least create that little seed of doubt that people can hold on to. And then there's the whole operation, like the CRC Advisors, of the world. There are plenty of groups like that are out there willing to do the kind of dirty work to keep growing the seed of doubt or driving the wedge, whatever it is. So it's a somewhat opaque machine in terms of like what the actual words are being said behind it, but the actual end goals and the actions that are being taken are, I guess, fairly clear.
You've got a lot of really good reporting pieces at Earthe about new science on the Arctic and Antarctica and what's happening in Siberia and temperatures. And I'm running out of time here, and I want everybody to go read those because Brian does great reporting. But before I do, I want to ask you about one final piece, your most recent piece at Earthe, which is titled "The Danger of Amazon's $2 billion Climate Fund." So this week, Amazon rolled out their new climate plan. It's a $2 billion investment fund for low and no carbon technology. And you went to Earthe and attacked it. And disparaged it. So my question is, where do you get off? Why do you hate Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the good things they're trying to do for the environment?
I just hate his ridiculous good looks. I'm so jealous. One bald guy to another. God damn it, Jeff.
At least he's got that weird eye. Yeah. He's not perfect. Doesn't have a perfect face. We all have our flaws. Go ahead. True. Sorry, that wasn't fair. No, so
I gotta say this. So I feel like it's somewhat of a mea culpa, anyways. Like, $2 billion to climate solutions. Like, I'm never gonna say that's like a bad thing. Like, $2 billion for climate solutions, something we can all agree is generally good. I think it's just at the end of the day, it comes down to how you approach it, and what Amazon has kind of shown in the way it's acted as, a corporation is that it really doesn't seem to value, humans that much. Its warehouse workers have kind of been, treated pretty crappy for a long time, but particularly during the coronavirus outbreak when they complained about it. One of the leaders at the Staten Island plant was fired. So clearly, Amazon and sort of its connection with people is not super strong. Its track record is not great. And so what concerns me when I look at, $2 billion for low carbon and no carbon climate solutions is, their announcement made no mention of thinking about, what's the just impact of this? What's the human impact of this? Or, what is the justice angle? So, they were going to evaluate these solutions based solely on the fact that, how much carbon could they cut? And, in theory, how much money could they make Amazon by investing in them? Which, as a corporation, on some level, totally rational, if kind of crazy to me as a person that thinks about what are the impacts on people. And so, the danger with this $2 billion fund is, one, Amazon stands to profit in a major way and become, widen that gap of inequality between its shareholders and everyone else. But, two, really, it comes down to, what are the solutions it's funding? We've seen what venture capital does when it funds something like, say, Uber, where all of a sudden you're trapping millions of people in the gig economy, leasing cars from Uber and driving for Uber and making wages that don't really cover, the actual cost of living. And so it just gives me pause for thought about, what is Amazon's real commitment here? Is it to draw down carbon? That's great. But is it to actually do it in a just way? It doesn't seem like it. And that's what I think that's where the danger lies. Because if you don't do it in a just way, we're just going to end up recreating kind of like the current shitty world we have, which is something that I'm not particularly a fan of.
Yeah, well explained. That's a really good piece. Read everything Brian is writing at Earthe, or follow him on Twitter as well. He's awesome there, and you got to read him there. Before we let you go, at BL Kahn, by the way, I'll include all of this and information for Brian in today's show notes. But before we go, just a word about, and I'm sure hopefully I'll get to talk to you plenty more before the election, which is in about 130 days. But as a journalist, your job is to look at the latest science and the concerns scientists have and consensus. You also look at policy solutions being offered by politicians at the local, state, and federal and international level. And you evaluate those things and you write pieces and you do journalism on. And so, when you look at the current, the time remaining and the current Republican Party, which is overwhelmingly, seemingly still not concerned about climate change and overwhelmingly also still in denial about the scientific consensus about climate change, not to mention this president's continued attack on science and just making shit up about all of it. How do you look at how important this election is for the planet's health in terms of the science, in terms of the current stances by current Republicans and those campaigning as Democrats and this new progressive movement, and obviously Joe Biden? How do you, I'm sure you'll be writing more about that as we get closer, but how are you looking at right now what we're facing in the next 130 days?
This is, the next 130 days, what happens November, those aren't the things. They don't decide, the absolute fate of the world, but they decide basically the course of the next few decades in a lot of ways, potentially the next century of human existence. And so, I take all elections very seriously, but I take this one particularly seriously because the choice could not be clearer on not just climate, but on any number of issues from, racial justice to inequality, to health. There are just, everything is on the line. But in terms of climate, this is the big one. And, right now it seems like there's a lot of jockeying within the Democratic Party on how serious they're going to get on climate. It remains to be seen. There are some excellent proposals out there, including ones that would be, quote unquote, compromise proposals that would sort of bridge, the Bernie side of things where there's, this big $16 trillion climate plan, and the Biden side of things where there's, $1 trillion or so in climate investments. Do I want to see the U.S. and the world go big on climate? Absolutely. Would I be happy if there was, that kind of middle ground compromise? If it was, I could live with that. I think that, the bottom line, though, is that we need a Democrat in the White House. We need to win back the Senate, got to hold the House, and then you got to get to work.
Well said. Brian, thank you as always for joining me. I really appreciate your time. One of my favorite places to read about environmental issues is Earthe, where Brian is managing director, a real important journalist doing really important work. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Brian Kahn on Twitter at BLKahn, Kahn. Please let him know you heard him here. And if you haven't signed up for a paid subscription, now's the time. Go to patreon.com/PeteDominic or click on the paid subscription link in the show notes. Also, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that I am putting the time codes in the show notes and on Patreon for subscribers, so you can, if I have 2 or 3 guests, which is pretty much the norm, you can see where exactly in the podcast that conversation starts. My idea is to put out as much content as I can. And you find the information and the guests and conversations that you're most interested in, and you can skip ahead to them if you don't want to hear me yapping away at the top or any other guests. You want to go to the person, specific person, you can look at the time codes in the show notes and get right to it. So hopefully you are doing that. Also on social media, I am posting a talk that I'm moderating today. If you're listening to this on Thursday, June 25th, it'll probably be available online after that. But it's called Reimagining America, How to Be a Strong Ally. I've got Ben Cohen from Ben & Jerry's, Barbara Clark, who's an economist and investor, and a great professor and author, Jonathan Metzl. It is white folks talking about how we can do better to be good allies to black and brown folks. And it's great in partnership with the Grio. Reimagining America, you can check that out. June 25th, that's at 4 p.m. And I'm sure most of you are probably listening to this after it's over, and I will let you know on my social media where it's available online. Okay, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. I know that shit is crazy and scary and wild and frustrating, and that's what I'm here for. I'm here for you. I'm here to hear from you and hear your ideas and concerns and try to bring people on to help us understand the way forward. And it is together with each other and not alone. I love you. I'll talk to you tomorrow.